Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's BATIC Institute webinar on federal fund swap programs. My name is Susan Howard, and I'm director of the BATIC Institute. Today's webinar will be approximately an hour in length and will include speakers from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the Connecticut Department of Transportation, and the Iowa Department of Transportation. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session responding to questions submitted by you, our audience. Before we get started, I'll go through a few logistics. If you go to the next slide, thank you. You should have received an email with a link to today's PowerPoint presentations. And if you didn't receive this, please visit the BATIC website at financingtransportation.org, where you can find the presentations available for download. Everyone will be on mute during the duration of the webinar. At any time, you can submit a question through the Q&A box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel for the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of our presentations. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for download on our website within the next few days. Next slide. Just to provide a little bit of background about the BATIC Institute, we provide capacity building support to state departments of transportation and their partners on the use of project finance techniques for surface transportation improvements. We help build this capacity through a program of training, sharing of best practices, and online educational services like this webinar. The BATIC Institute also undertakes original research and works to foster dialogue around transportation finance techniques. And the BATIC Institute is delivered in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration. For more information, please visit our website at financingtransportation.org. Today's webinar will explore the practice of federal fund swaps, under which local agencies can trade their allocated federal funds for state transportation dollars. Steve Cohen with the U.S. Government Accountability Office will discuss the findings of a report his agency published in October of 2020 on the practice of federal fund swapping. We'll then hear from Bill Grant and Hugh Hayward with the Connecticut Department of Transportation about their local transportation capital improvement program. This will be followed by a presentation from Nicole Moore with the Iowa Department of Transportation on their fund swap program. And again, during the final 15 minutes or so of the webinar, our speakers will be available to answer questions submitted by the audience. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with Steve's presentation. Thank you all for joining us.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here today to share with you the work that GAO did on the issue of federal highway funding exchange programs, or fund swapping programs. As I'm sure most of you know, GAO is the investigative arm of Congress. We are an independent, nonpartisan agency that provides fact-based information to the Congress and recommendations to assist in its oversight of federal programs and activities. We initiate most of our work at the request of committees of Congress, and in late 2019, we received a request from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee asking us to look into fund swapping. We issued our report last October. Let me first answer the question we always ask when we receive a request like this: what is fund swapping? My first slide shows how we defined it in our report. Fund swapping programs are arrangements in which state DOTs allow local agencies to exchange their state's proposed allocation of federal aid highway funds for state transportation funds. When swapping occurs, local agencies must comply with applicable state and local requirements, and generally not federal requirements. The chair and vice chair of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure asked GAO to review the prevalence of fund swapping programs and why they were put in place. They were also interested in what the impact the practice was having on adherence to federal requirements writ large. Of particular interest to them was the payment of prevailing wages and how that affects local economies. In response to this request, GAO reviewed the extent to which state and local agencies engage in federal fund swapping, factors that affected whether state and local agencies engaged in federal fund swapping, and what is known about the impact fund swapping has on the application of selected federal requirements. To conduct our work, we distributed a questionnaire to 50 state DOTs. We did not survey DC or Puerto Rico, and received a 100% response rate. This questionnaire allowed us to ascertain which state DOTs were currently engaging in fund swapping or had done so in the past 5 years. It also gave us some insights into how many states were considering fund swapping and some of the reasons why states chose not to engage in the practice. We conducted interviews with each of the states currently engaging in fund swapping, and in 4 states, we also conducted interviews with local public agencies and other stakeholders. My next slide addresses the first of our objectives, the extent of funding exchange programs. 15 states, as you can see on the slide, had funding exchange programs and engaged in fund swapping between 2016 and 2020. Not every state swapped in every year. Some swapped in some years, but not in others. This figure shows the percentage of the state's federal aid apportionment that was swapped in 2019, or for 4 states, the most recent year available. As you can see, the 2 largest programs, as measured by the share of total federal aid swapped, will be following me on this panel, Iowa and Connecticut. And by this measure, Iowa has by far the largest funding exchange program in the country. We also learned that 7 states are considering establishing funding exchange programs. The next slide shows the source of federal aid funds among the core highway programs used in fund swapping. As you can see, every one of the 15 states used surface transportation block grant funds, 11 of them exclusively. Nearly all 15 states used those STBG funds that are suballocated to areas based on population to conduct the swaps. Moving on now to some of the factors influencing whether states establish funding exchange programs, the benefits cited included reducing the risk of noncompliance with federal requirements. This reflects widespread consensus view among state DOTs that A, states tend to be more familiar with the federal aid process, and B, local agencies tend to be better equipped to comply with state rather than federal requirements. State DOTs and local agencies also believed swapping provided local agencies greater flexibility and control over local projects. For example, swapping provided local agencies with the flexibility to pursue projects with state funds that they could not otherwise pursue with federal funds due to eligibility requirements. The general consensus view among both states and local agencies was that undertaking projects with state funds allowed localities to undertake projects that better aligned with their needs and priorities. Finally, both states and local agencies thought swapping put them in a better position to save time and money on project delivery. For local agencies, it was about completing projects more quickly for less. States believed swapping saved resources because it takes more staff and time to oversee a federal LPA project than to oversee a state-funded local project. My next slide shows the principal obstacles cited by state officials, which included lack of funding. 10 of the states that do not have funding exchange programs told us they did not have sufficient state funds to have a swap program. We also heard from 2 states that had swap programs at one point that they ended their programs for that reason. State law was another obstacle. States generally require enabling legislation to initiate a funding exchange program. Other states cited restrictions in state law, such as limitation on the use of state funds off the state highway system, or practical considerations, including in states where local agencies do not administer federally funded projects. This brings us to our 3rd objective in my next slide, the impact of fund swapping. We concluded that the impact of fund swapping on the payment of prevailing wages and the application of other federal requirements cannot be definitively determined. To address the question we were asked, we would have wanted to compare the number and types of projects state DOTs administered with swapped federal dollars to the number and types of projects local agencies administered with swapped state dollars. In other words, what did the state do with the swapped federal dollars compared to what the locality would have done with them, and how did that differ in terms of prevailing wages paid and compliance with other federal requirements? Ultimately, the data needed to answer this question just wasn't available because states generally do not track which state-administered projects were funded with federal funds swapped by local agencies. As we heard many times during the course of our work, swapped federal funds go back into the pot. They lose their identity as swapped funds and are then programmed for other projects on the state highway system. Moreover, if one wants to compare what the state did with swapped funds versus what the local agency would have done, it is not possible to know if a local agency implemented the same number and types of projects with state funds that it would have implemented with federal funds. As we learned during the course of our review, and as I mentioned earlier, some local agencies develop projects that would otherwise not be eligible for federal aid. So that's what we don't know. What we do know, and what I'm showing on the next slide, is based on our analysis of federal aid highway program requirements and our discussions with state DOTs. One is that federal funding is a zero-sum game. The same amount of federal aid funds, which are subject to federal requirements, are made available to the states, and the same amount of funding is expended statewide with fund swapping as it is expended without fund swapping. The same is basically true of STBG funds suballocated to areas with populations exceeding 200,000, so-called TMAs. Even if a TMA is swapping STBG out, sub-allocated funds for state funds, those sub-allocations are specified in law, and at the end of the day, the same amount of those federal aid funds, which are subject to federal requirements, are made available to the TMAs, with or without swapping. Fund swapping could increase or decrease the amount of federal funding to a particular locality. Our report talks a lot about the STBG rules for sub-allocating funds to areas with a population of 200,000 or less, and it's way too much for me to get into in my allotted time. But with swapping, fewer projects in one local area could be subject to prevailing wage requirements and other federal requirements, while another local area could see an increase in the number of projects subject to those requirements. From the standpoint of the local agency with fewer federal projects, they could see an impact. At the state level, state DOTs could be using swapped funds to initiate additional projects, resulting in more state projects being subject to federal requirements. States could also be increasing the federal share on the same number of federal aid projects. And since it only takes one federal dollar to federalize a project, this would result in fewer projects being subject to federal requirements than would have occurred before swapping. At least one state DOT we spoke with during our work told us that it is the practice in their state to use swapped funds to increase the federal share on existing projects. Finally, state DOTs in about half the states with swap programs told us they have state-level prevailing wage laws and that they apply those to non-federally funded projects. In 4 of the states that told us they did not have prevailing wage laws, state DOTs told us they did not think that the lack of such a law affected wages paid in their state. Now, this was pre-COVID, and they cited the strength of their economies and low unemployment in their states as factors that supported higher wages on all projects. 2 state DOTs that told us they did not have prevailing wage laws did believe that wages paid on state-funded projects could be less. The responses were similar with regard to other federal requirements, again, focused mainly on what state laws, if any, might be in place. That concludes my presentation. I look forward to answering your questions and to the discussion to follow. And I will now turn it over to Bill Grant from the Connecticut DOT.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon. I'd like to speak with you today about the Connecticut Department of Transportation Local Transportation Capital Improvement Program, or LOTCIP. So as backdrop for the LOTCIP, the history of the infrastructure improvements with LPAs at Connecticut DOT. Back in 1991, the ST transportation legislation provided for the federal STP urban program, which provided $40 to $60 million in federal funds for eligible LPA roadways. Under that program, as the stewards of the federal funds, CONDOT was required to provide oversight on the administration of those funds, which proved to be very resource intensive. And what we've found is that most municipalities are not accustomed to and have difficulty with the federal Title 23 requirements. And this was especially magnified in 2009 when the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, came to be. Connecticut opted to provide $90 million of the federal stimulus funds to the municipalities in the state of Connecticut. And being federal funds, the federal Title 23 requirements were applicable to those funds, and CONDOT was required to provide oversight and also extensive reporting associated with the program. This proved to be very burdensome on the Connecticut DOT and the municipalities. We were able to accomplish it, but it was a heavy lift. That caused us to say, how can CONDOT improve its business practice? How can we help municipalities affect local capital improvements on their network and minimize CONDOT resource involvement in the accomplishment of that goal? So the answer was that Connecticut DOT proposed a new fund swap program called the LOTCIP. The program had 2 main goals. Was to develop a program that makes it easier for municipalities to implement local capital improvements using state funds, and to minimize Connecticut DOT oversight and allow Connecticut DOT to focus its limited resources on federal aid. So in the development of the LOTCIP, legislation was drafted in September of 2012. Connecticut DOT put together a professional working group in February of 2013 to write the LOTCIP guidelines, or the rules by which the program would function. And that group included Connecticut DOT staff and also municipal and regional members. We felt it was important to include the municipal and regional folks as they were going to be the end users of the program. In July of 2013, Public Act 13239 was passed, and it established the LOTSIP to be a 100% state-funded program that would become effective in November of 2013. The basic legislation content was, of course, to establish the LOTSIP program, but also that the Connecticut DOT Commissioner may request bond funds for the program each year. The Connecticut DOT will accept applications from the councils of governments, and funding will be provided under guidelines written by the Connecticut DOT. Improvements need to have a service life of approximately 20 years to be commensurate with the debt service on the bonds that are funding the program. And also, the improvements are not considered a state action when on a locally owned roadway for flood management permitting. The purpose there was to simplify the environmental permitting process and also to extract the Connecticut DOT from that process where possible. So the LOTSIP guidelines, we're currently on our third version that was issued in March 2019. We are currently working on our fourth edition that we expect to issue in March of this year. And it's important to note that these various versions of the guidelines were the result of a commitment that we made to the COGS and the municipalities to change this program as issues might be encountered, and everyone involved with the program, being the Connecticut DOT, the councils of government, and the municipalities, gained experience in the program. So we've honored our commitment to make changes to the program to improve it over time. The LOTSIP is intended to be a balance between a giveaway grant program and the cumbersome federal Title 23 requirements. Obviously, being a $60 million a year program on average, we did not want to make it just a free grant giveaway, but we also, per the original intent of the program, was to get away from the cumbersome, time-consuming federal Title 23 requirements. So the basic parameters of the LOTSIP is our state funds distributed to the 9 regional councils of governments, or COGS, following the federal population model. It's a dollar for dollar or an even swap. The LOTSIP funds are held in Connecticut DOT's financial management system in COG-specific accounts, or parent projects as we call them, until individual LOTSIP projects are ready for delivery by the municipalities. And we also consciously chose to mirror the federal STBG eligibility rules, such as roadway classification needing to be an urban collector or higher, expenditure of the funds within urbanized areas. And we consciously chose that to prevent projects being submitted to the program that necessarily don't benefit the general public. As an example, we don't want municipalities coming in wanting to pave cul-de-sac roadways, locally classified roadways that don't benefit the general motoring public. In the LOTSIP, the project scoping and design responsibilities are shifted to the COGS and the municipalities. The Connecticut DOT is not involved in the scoping of these projects or involved typically in the design phases. Municipality in LOTSIP is required to pay 100% of the project design costs. We consider that the local contribution to the project, or their skin in the game, if you will. The added benefit to that is that it extracts the Connecticut DOT from the associated financial transactions that would be required if we were to participate in a project design phase. In the LOTSIP, the construction phase is 100% funded under the program. There is no local share required in the construction phase. The Connecticut DOT is not involved in design and reviews unless the project affects a state-owned roadway or facility, and we're also not involved in construction oversight and inspection. So how do the LOTSIP projects get into the program? So the COGS solicit their member municipalities for project proposals. The COG ranks and selects project proposals through a competitive process. The Connecticut DOT does not dictate that selection process. The COGs each run their own solicitation, ranking, and selection process. The municipality completes a full LOTSIP project application, submits that to the council and governments, and it goes through their process. And what comes out of the other side of that process as projects to be included in the program, the COG submits those LOTSIP applications on a rolling basis to the Connecticut DOT. So once the Connecticut DOT receives the application, we have a team of professionals that reviews each proposal. We review it for completeness, eligibility requirements, purpose and need, and service life. That typically initiates a dialogue with the sponsoring municipality about certain aspects of the projects. We can get clarifications. updates to the cost estimate based on things that we might find. So once that iterative process is completed and CONDOT is satisfied, we send what we call a commitment to fund letter to the Council of Governments and the municipality. And that letter contains the level of funding that's going to be committed to the project, as well as project-specific and general conditions associated with the LOTSIP program as they apply to that specific project. And that commitment to fund letter essentially serves as the green light for the municipality to begin preliminary design for the project. And again, it's important to note that the DOT is not involved in technical reviews of the design. The municipality is responsible for developing the design as well as having peer reviews of the design to ensure that it's complete and correct. If during the design phase the project is found to change in scope for some reason, or if there's a 20% cost increase or more, the municipality needs to justify that to the Council of Governments and the Connecticut DOT. LOTSIP environmental permitting and rights-of-way. The environmental permitting in LOTSIP is the responsibility of the municipality. The DOT is not involved in that, unless, of course, it involves a state facility. Flood management certification is the responsibility of the municipality when the improvements are on a locally owned roadway. And if a project in the LOTSIP is found to require rights-of-way, the acquisitions can be performed either by the municipality or by the state, but in all cases, the acquisitions need to follow the Uniform Act for property acquisitions. So when a project in LOTSIP, the design is completed by the municipality forwards a final design submission package or PS&E package to the Council of Governments, who reviews it, makes comments on it, and once they're satisfied that it's complete and correct, they send it over to Connecticut DOT along with project-specific certifications that we require for various aspects of the project. So upon acceptance of the contract package by CONDOT, we review it to be sure that it includes various boilerplate contract provisions, including state wage rates. And once we're satisfied that contract package is complete and contains all the necessary provisions, Connecticut DOT sends what we call a project authorization letter or a PAL agreement to the municipality based on the final estimate. That essentially serves as the agreement between the state of Connecticut and the municipality for the construction phase of the project. Once that PAL is signed by the municipality and returned to Connecticut DOT, we authorize the municipality to advertise the project for construction bids. Once the municipality opens the bids, they submit the results to Connecticut DOT through the COG, and the CONDOT makes a grant payment to the municipality for 100% of the accepted low bid, plus a 10% allowance for contingencies and another 10% allowance for incidentals to construction, such as construction inspection activities and materials testing. It should be noted, too, that the construction funds are essentially capped at that amount. If the cost of the project goes over in construction, it is generally the responsibility of the municipality to cover that cost increase. In LOTSIP, the construction contracts are administered and overseen by the municipality. We require that the municipality designate a municipal employee to be in responsible charge of the LOTSIP project. And construction inspection is performed by municipal staff or a consultant hired by the municipality. When a LOTSIP job is completed in construction, the municipality is required to submit to the Connecticut DOT through the COG final acceptance of the project and material certifications, as well as final expenditure information. And Connecticut DOT uses that financial information to perform a final audit and grant closeout for the project. In terms of LOTSIP communication, Connecticut DOT requires quarterly reporting from the councils of governments on project costs and schedules. The COGs dialogue with their member municipalities regularly on the status of projects in design and construction, and they report to us on a quarterly basis what the project costs are, what the project completion schedule is going to be, what the project design completion schedule might be, and that also enables us to plan on the financial needs for the program. Connecticut DOT and the COGs have quarterly meetings. A portion of that meeting is dedicated to the LOTSIP, where the Connecticut DOT talks about the current status of the LOTSIP in terms of budget, things that we might see that are upcoming. And we also have a Q&A session with the councils of governments to hear any of their concerns if they have specific questions about something that's happening with the LOTSIP. We also have annual meetings with each COG specific to their LOTSIP program, where we discuss the financial status of their program and upcoming financial needs, as well as any other concerns they might have about the program. Then, of course, there is normal project-level day-to-day communication between the Connecticut DOT, the councils of governments, and the municipalities. So LOTSIP, the key points to remember. LOTSIP fundamentally shifts project responsibilities to the COGs and municipalities through a certification process. Connecticut DOT now utilizes the federal STBG urban funds on predominantly state-owned infrastructure. COGs in their member towns over the past 7 years, it's going on 8 years now, have grown to value the LOTSIP. It's been preserved through multiple difficult state budget cycles. Legislators have supported this program. They get input from their municipalities on how important this program is to accomplishing these infrastructure improvements at the local level. Overall, the LOTSIP has met the 2 original program goals, namely to make it easier and simpler for municipalities to accomplish local capital improvement projects with less burdensome requirements, and it's also minimized the level of resources necessary at CONDOT to help the municipalities affect those improvements. If you have questions, you can contact myself or Hugh Hayward. The email addresses are on your screen. Thank you. Speaking next will be Nicole Moore from Iowa DOT.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Moore, and I'm with the Iowa DOT Local Systems Bureau. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the federal aid swap process that we have started in Iowa. So first of all, I'll get into why would the Iowa DOT and the LPAs even want to swap these federal funds? Well, as some of you may know, the FHWA requires the state DOTs to provide oversight on federal aid projects. LPA programs are seen nationally by FHWA as a high-risk area. It also requires a lot of effort on the Iowa DOT's part and other state DOTs for their state locals to provide that oversight role. We have numerous sets of guidance and various trainings that we put on every year for the locals. The picture you see here is our instructional memorandums to the LPAs. Just the table of contents is 7 pages, if that tells you anything about how much guidance that we provide to our locals. One thing that can happen if the LPAs don't follow the exact process in all of these IMs is that they could lose their federal aid funding. We certainly don't want that to happen to any of our LPAs, and so therefore that makes the swap fairly beneficial. So an overview of how we went about this process. There has been numerous years of discussion between the Iowa DOT and the locals in our state as to how we can go through this federal aid swap process. One thing that was needed in order to make this swap happen is the state legislature needed to pass a bill allowing for swap. Essentially, primary road fund dollars were supposed to go to the Iowa DOT. So the Iowa DOT didn't have any money that we could in turn provide for the locals in order for the Iowa DOT to use all of the federal aid and still have an equivalent split to give the locals money that was not federal aid. So that legislation passed, and then the real work started. Essentially, what's happening is the same amount of federal aid dollars are still coming to the state of Iowa. The Iowa DOT is simply using those funds now, as opposed to giving those funds to the locals. We are giving an equivalent dollar amount of state primary road funds to the locals for their swap projects. Because of this, we're still using the exact same amount of federal aid dollars in the state of Iowa. So therefore, the same amount of dollars are still subject to all of the federal requirements, things such as Davis-Bacon wages and Buy America for any kind of steel product. It's just that the Iowa DOT owns the projects that we're using the federal aid on, and the Iowa DOT then administers most of those projects ourselves, rather than the LPA needing to administer a federal aid project, and then the DOT needing to provide an oversight role. So really, it's about efficiencies. The federal aid funds normally received by LPAs are exchanged for state funds. That is about $170 million per year for locals, And that number fluctuates a little bit from year to year, just depending on when projects actually get let. When we started developing this federal aid swap program, we had many, many meetings with a lot of different stakeholders from a lot of different groups. The counties, the cities, RPAs, the regional planning affiliations, as well as the MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations. Some things that were decided at kind of a high level were that all of these swap projects would have a dollar for dollar exchange rate. Some states, they would keep $1 and then only provide, say, 80 or 90 cents on the dollar to the locals. And that was a big sticking point for the state of Iowa, was that everyone wanted that to be a dollar for dollar exchange rate. The projects had to be let at the Iowa DOT, even the swap projects. We have always required that for federal aid, that they let the projects at the Iowa DOT with a very few exceptions. And our contractors group really likes the letting process that the Iowa DOT has. And so that was a big sticking point for them that we were happy to oblige. The federal aid swap funds are also only to be used for construction projects. Since that was the intent of the federal aid, we wanted that to also be the intent of the swap funds. So what we didn't want was maintenance type projects or salaries to be paid with these swap funds. And then depending on what happens with federal funding levels over the course of several years, those swap funds would be available depending on what those federal funding levels are. Also, Iowa DOT closely monitors our cash flow. And so that's also a consideration, but it hasn't been a problem so far. We also wanted to make sure that since this is taxpayer money, we wanted to provide some oversight for the locals, just so that we make sure that they're doing the right thing. So we have many different programs that we use the federal aid swap funding for, and I'll share a little bit about each of those programs. The Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, that name probably sounds familiar to most of you. So this is the set aside that the Iowa DOT was using for the locals under the federal aid for FAST Act and MAP 21. And that pot of money for Iowa is about $170 million per year. What we had done at the federal level when MAP 21 passed is we had broken the STBG program into several kind of set-asides. So we still do the STBG mostly for pavements, and that is allocated through the RPAs and MPOs. And then we have a county HBP, or Highway Bridge Program, which also may sound familiar because of the Highway Bridge Program that was under the Safety Loop Bill. And then a city HBP program, which is grant-based, based on priority points for cities. So with the STBG swap, we still allocate those funds through the RPAs and MPOs. We expanded upon the eligible routes. So with federal aid, all of the eligible routes include anything above a minor collector, and then up to 15% of the STBG fund could be used on rural minor collectors. And using that on rural minor collectors was kind of hard for us to manage and track at the federal level. But that was one of the things that we talked about in some of these stakeholder meetings, was that the counties wanted to be able to use the swap STBG funding on all federal aid eligible routes, such as major collectors and anything higher than that. But they wanted to also include rural minor collectors. We also have a farm to market system in the state of Iowa, which generally aligns with major and minor collectors, but not always. And so they wanted to include the farm to market system routes. And we thought that was a good use of this federal aid swap money. So we agreed. And I think we all agreed that the STBG swap dollars should not be used on roads classified as local roads. So that is one of the stipulations. Bridges on any road are allowed to be funded through the RPAs or MPOs as well, if that RPA or MPO so chooses. And then we'll get into the bridge programs here on the next slide. We also wanted to allow up to 100% funding reimbursement as opposed to 80% that is used at the federal level. So then the local has to come up with less match funding. It is eligible to use for preliminary engineering and construction engineering, but it is subject to MPO and RPA requirements. So each individual RPA or MPO could say no. It's not encouraged because it is an administrative burden for all that are involved. So for the county highway bridge program, there's an allocation given to each county, which there are 99 counties in Iowa. This is a 100% funding program for construction. No match is required. We utilized very similar requirements as to what was under the HPP program under Safety Lou at the federal level. So the bridges had to be SD or FO. Now they have to be poor condition because that definition was changed at the federal level. The sufficiency rating has to be 80 or less for a bridge rehab and 60 or less for a bridge reconstruction. Also, it has to have an average daily traffic count of 25 or more in order to make that bridge eligible for this funding. For the City Bridge program, they have a priority point worksheet that they use. It's based on sufficiency rating, ADT, the detour length, and the bridge posting, which is item 70 on the SINA report. You can see a picture of it there. That's in an instructional memorandum that the Iowa DOT has. We allow 100% funding for those as well. The local match is considered to be the consultant design or construction inspection, but only construction costs are eligible for reimbursement from the SWAP program. We also have a small highway safety improvement program for the secondary roads or the county roads. $2 million annually gets put into that program, and we just decided to continue the application process that we had previously used for that program when it was federal aid. There are also some ICAP projects that we use the federal aid SWAP funding for. So ICAP is Iowa's Clean Air Attainment Program. And that was part of the CMAQ program at the federal level, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. Some need to still follow the federal regulation for various reasons. Some programs at the federal level we were not allowed to swap. Quite a few of the transportation alternatives projects, as well as federal recreational trails, were not allowed to be swapped because the road use tax fund in Iowa is constitutionally protected to be spent on roads. So we can't spend that money on trails off of the roadway system. Some efficiencies that we noticed with the swap are that several items are not needed on the construction side now. We don't need to have a DBE commitment. Certainly DBEs are always welcome to bid on projects or subcontract on projects, but without having to meet a certain DBE commitment at the federal level, there's less paperwork to fill out on the construction inspection side of things. Davis-Bacon wages, certainly we encourage contractors to pay a livable wage to their employees, but we don't have to fill out certified payrolls. We don't have to conduct wage rate interviews, things like that. Also, Buy America is not required. While it's certainly fine for the contractor to provide American steel, we don't have to make sure that every single certification includes a statement about the steel being Buy America. The NEPA process through FHWA does not need to be conducted. There are several items with the NEPA process where your NEPA clearance has to be obtained before you can do final design. It also, in most cases, must be obtained before you can buy right-of-way. And without having to submit all of those documents into one central location, it streamlines things. There are a lot of environmental requirements that remain, and I'll get into those in a little bit. We're certainly not harming the environment by any means, but we just don't have to go through a more formal process such as NEPA. We've also streamlined some things on the project development side. Before, we required a concept statement and preliminary plans, which we don't require now for federal aid swap projects. The concept statement was kind of the initial NEPA information that was provided. And now, since we don't need all that NEPA information, we have other forms that they can fill out for environmental requirements, and they can get started on those and save time. We have some construction oversight efficiencies as well, especially from the DOT standpoint of providing that oversight role to the local public agencies. We also don't need to worry so much about project end dates or inactive obligations, which has been something that Iowa has struggled with in the past. So Like I mentioned earlier, we have some project development milestones. So I've highlighted in red and added strikeout to show you how the differences are for federal aid versus SWAP. So you can see we still have a lot of requirements for them to turn in a project to the Iowa DOT and let that project, but they do save time because the concept was due a year before the project was let. They have to now work on their environmental permits and forms about 6 months before the project gets let. They also would need to work on design exceptions before they would turn in their check plans. Essentially, what we call check plans is final plans that we are checking. And then we'll provide comments on those check plans. And then when they turn in final plans, all of the comments on the check plans are expected to be addressed. So for the environmental process, we of course wanted to make sure that we were not doing any kind of harm to the environment, that we were looking at all of the things that needed to be looked at. There are some federal laws that apply to any project, not just federal aid funded projects. So we reviewed all of that. We also reviewed state laws that apply to all projects. For materials on the federal aid SWAP side of things, we revised some of the materials instructional memorandums. The DOT was providing a lot of materials oversight. So the contractor would perform a quality control on the materials, and then the LPA, the project engineer, would check on occasion what the contractor was doing, depending on if it was an HMA project or a PCC project or a bridge project. The checking frequencies were different. And then the DOT would provide another set of checks to make sure that the LPA was performing the tests correctly. I refer to that as checking the checker's checker. So that's no longer required. However, the local public agency or the project engineer does need to check the contractor. It's of course in the local agency's best interest to make sure that the project that they are going to own has high quality materials that have, say, the correct air and slump for a concrete project. So some of those revisions happened, and we worked a lot with materials and the locals in order to get those the way that we wanted them. Another thing that we changed was a construction and project closeout for these federal aid SWAP projects. Pre-construction meetings, we need to have our oversight staff still be invited to those, and they will attend if they are able. Prior to that, on federal aid projects, they were required to attend, so that could be a little bit of a scheduling problem at times. The LPA is still, of course, required to inspect their project. Change orders get reviewed and approved by our local systems field staff. And then for SWAP projects, we still perform a field completion during construction or when construction is nearly finished. The LPAs have to still audit their own books, and then we may or may not do a review on their paperwork for that. So we're reviewing all construction, but we're not necessarily reviewing the paperwork. What we decided on was one project review on the paperwork side of things per LPA every 3 years. We can do more if necessary, but that's to help the DOT so that we don't have quite as much oversight, since that is quite an effort for us to perform that. We wanted to get involved with more teaching moments and learning opportunities as opposed to having kind of a gotcha mentality. So we think this has been good for everyone. With that, I think we are moving into our question and answer session. So if anyone has questions, please let me know.
All right. Thank you so much to Bill and Nicole. We really appreciate it. We do have some questions that have come in, so we'll just get started with those, and I'll let you know who I'm posing the question to. But I guess this is for our state DOT folks, the first one. Are local projects let through the states/DOTs, and does that create any issues in keeping funding sources separate?
Hi, it's Bill Grant from Connecticut DOT. In our LOTSIT program, the projects are not let through the state's procurement system. Each municipality bids their own projects. And I'm not sure I understand the second part of that question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. I think it goes to the issue of let me track it back. I'm sorry. About keeping funding sources separate. I guess if the state DOT is not letting them, then it might not be as much an issue. But this might also go to what Steve was talking about earlier, like sort of the sources of the funds and what identity they maintain through a fund swap process. So it just says if our local projects let through the states, and does that create any issues in keeping funding sources separate?
Yeah, I would say no, because the LOTSIP funds travel as their own program here in Connecticut. So there's no intermingling of other fund sources or combining bidding of projects and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Nicole, did you want to respond to that too?
Sure. Yeah, in Iowa, we do require that the swap projects be let at the Iowa DOT. We also require that counties let their farm to market funded projects at the DOT. So the farm to market fund is 8% of the state road use tax fund, and then it's apportioned to all 99 counties via some formulas. And so those projects are required to be let at the DOT. They're welcome to let any other kind of funded projects at the DOT, but they don't have to. So other kinds of state aid or just their regular local funding, they could let those at the DOT. And we kind of track their funding sources based somewhat on the project number, but then sometimes there's like the kind of lesser funding source. And usually we know what kind of funding sources they have in their projects because of the agreements that we sign with them for anything other than local or farm to market funding. And then, like I said, our project number can kind of tell that. So we don't necessarily have problems with the intermingled funding. Sometimes with swap projects, the farm to market account will pay for the project, and that farm to market account is actually housed at the DOT, but it's the county's money. And then if it's locally funded, then it's a reimbursement program for the swap funds. So we just pay them back once they request that reimbursement. So that's kind of how that works.
Great, thank you so much. A question for Steve. We got a couple questions sort of related to this, but we're curious what the congressional reaction has been to the GAO report. Do there seem to be serious concerns about the fund swap process, or do you feel like members of Congress are just sort of curious about it? And so can you share a little bit about what the reaction has been to your recently released report?
Sure. And I think first of all, from the standpoint of the Hill, that they did not either authorize nor prohibit fund swapping. It's not something that's part of federal legislation. It's not something that FHWA gets directly involved in overseeing. So I think there was obviously a genuine desire to try to understand more about these programs. I mean, the chairman had an understanding of the programs in Oregon. The vice chair had an understanding of how programs were working in the state of Iowa. So I think they genuinely appreciated the broader perspective. I would mention that in terms of specific legislation, H.R. 2, which was introduced in the last Congress, passed the House, but did not become law, would require any state setting up a funding exchange program to certify that the state has a prevailing wage and domestic content requirement comparable to federal requirements. And we'll just have to wait and see whether that provision is reintroduced in the current Congress.
Great, thank you so much. A question for Nicole. Are DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, commitments bolstered under federal aid funded projects to offset losses by constructing with local dollars?
So the Iowa DOT has a committee that looks at DBE commitments for all federal aid projects. So I think probably there's more opportunities for DBEs to bid work on our larger state jobs than there was before on some of the smaller local public agency federal aid projects. But whether they require more, I don't know the answer to that. I just don't get involved in those discussions. But I've heard, through various folks around the DOT that it's pretty similar or a little bit better even for the DBEs.
Thank you. We've got a question here about quote unquote exchange rates. And I think it's an interesting one because the GAO report would have looked at different exchange rates that states have set up. Both Connecticut and Iowa seem to be 1-to-1 states. So I'm curious, the question's asking, what did GAO find out about different states using different exchange rates? I guess that's one for Steve. And maybe for the other.
We didn't really delve into that issue.
Okay. For Connecticut and Iowa, have you always had a 1-for-1 rate? Has that changed at all over the life of your program, or is that a value that was sort of held consistently?
So this is Hugh Hayward for Connecticut DOT, and we have always had a 1-for-1 exchange since program inception, going back 7.5 years. And part of the reason we did that is, quite honestly, to keep it simple and straightforward. Now, what we do when we have our yearly budget approved at the state level for a certain level of LOTSIP funds, we take a small part of that off the top across all the regional council of governments to pay for our staff time that's necessary to run the program. And we also give a piece to each regional council of government for administrative purposes to help them run the program. So we've never got into any kind of ratios of 90% or whatever to help us fund the program. It's always been a straightforward 1-for-1, and no one has ever expressed any distaste with that. It's worked well for us.
In Iowa, we have also always had the dollar-for-dollar exchange rate, and our program started in October of, I think it was 2018. Now I'm questioning myself, it might have been 17, but regardless, whenever it started, it's always been a dollar-for-dollar. That was part of the swap policy that we passed with all the locals and the commission at the DOT level.
Great, thank you. So one thing that jumps out is that it seems that STBG funds are the most commonly swapped. Nicole, you went into some detail about the other sources that you all use and some that you don't use, but I'm curious to hear from Steve if that was a conclusion you drew from your interviews with the states, and why. I mean, besides the flexibility, and the fact that there's a suballocation, are those the main reasons that we generally see STBG most commonly as the source of swapped funds?
I would be curious to what my friends at the state DOT think of this. I can surmise that those funds are the ones that have been suballocated. So I think by tradition and certain extent, certainly by laws of individual states, those since ICE-T have more or less been thought of as the funds that can go to local governments. I think it evolved from a tradition, but I would I'd like to hear what Connecticut and Iowa think of that.
So Susan, this is Hugh Hayward again. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So in other words, since ICE-T in 1991 that established the program, that really gave regulatory authority to the LPAs and the Regional Council of Governments in Connecticut, over that long period of time, there was kind of a tug of war between our LPAs and the state DOT, in the sense that it started to become their money and not the state DOT's money. So they started to use it on more what's considered not regionally significant projects. And we found ourselves in a situation where we were always pushing back to solve the greater problems as opposed to the localized problems. So it became, quote unquote, their money to use. So that was the genesis of the fund swap, in a sense that Now we can use that money with their cooperation. They have to sign off on the STIP and the TIP on the state-owned assets, and we're giving them a different fund source to do what's perceived to be the more parochial improvements on the local network.
I would say it's similar in Iowa. Just historically, the STBG, or formerly STP, pot of money was what was passed down to the locals. And then under Safety Lou, I know we did give them, the locals, a lot of the highway bridge program funding as well. But those were the primary sources of money that the locals used from the federal aid. So that was kind of why we swapped the STBG program money now.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question because I think this one is important and relevant, since this is a partnership between the state DOTs and your local partner agencies. What level of support have you found within those communities for your state swapping programs? And, what do you think has been key to it being successful in nurturing that collaborative relationship?
So this is Hugh Hayward again from Connecticut. And I would say, we've had the 7.5 years of experience, and it was a lot of heavy lifting early on to convince the municipalities and the Regional Council of Governments that the program could work. They didn't trust that it would, but they also didn't feel that our legislature was going to give them a recurring separate revenue source to do what they wanted to do. Well, in the intervening years, because we've met our original goals in the sense that it's a lot easier for the municipalities to get the work done, and it's far easier for us to manage, it's grown so much in popularity that politically the program has survived multiple difficult budget cycles at the state level, because we have the municipalities and the COGs telling their legislators that, look, you can't touch this. This is a great program. You need to preserve it. So it's worked out in that sense for us, and it's just made our life easier at the federal level. We deal with federal aid all day long at DOT, and we're used to it. The LPAs are not. So we each kind of have our own program.
Right. Nicole, do you want to chime in quickly before we wrap up?
Sure. Yeah, in Iowa, from the LPA perspective, there wasn't a whole lot of convincing needed at the engineering level. So with the county engineers or the city public works directors, they were ready to implement the swap, as were we. So it's really been a partnership from the start, and that's how we've been able to have success with it. We had numerous stakeholder meetings going into swap. And then we've also had kind of check-in meetings with some of the leadership at the county engineer and city APWA state level. And, they know where to find us if they have problems that they would like to share with us. So we just have a really good back and forth relationship here in Iowa.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you all. Thanks to our audience for participating and for the great questions. Thank you to our panelists. Remind everyone that the webinar slides and recording will be available on the BATIC website shortly. And we hope that you'll, stay in touch with us and keep your eye out on information on future events. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.